couple of minutes to. We've still got a couple of minutes to run here, and we'll start on time. Welcome to our session today. It's great to have you. And Udo, you're in London. How's London today? Is it sunny, overcast?
Yeah, no, look, we've had it all today, but I'm happily reporting that it's dry skies and we have seen the sun today. So life is good in this part of the world. How about yourself? How's
nice, California? Actually, nice. Starting to cool off a little bit. It's my favorite time of year here, actually, in Southern California. You know, everywhere else in the country starts to have bad weather, snowstorms, freezes, and we're lucky enough to still have beautiful blue sky and beautiful.
Well, long may it stay that way.
Yeah. All right. So we just got a minute to go here, everybody, and we'll pretty much start on time because we're going to record this session, and anybody that's coming in late, we'll invite them to watch the recording. We want to honor your time, given that you got here ahead of time. So we'll get started in about a minute. You'll notice, everybody, that there's a Q&A menu item at the bottom of your screen. So that's where you would type in your questions that we would be able to see. I think the chat is just you and me, Udo, by the looks of it.
I believe so. Yeah. So I think it's the Q&A.
Yeah. And please do find the hand raise button, everybody. We don't need it right now, but we will use it a little bit as we go through here. So we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. I'm seeing more attendees coming in real time as we speak. Thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Mike Richardson. I'm in Southern California, and this is Udo Doring, and he is in London. And so we're glad that you're here with us, and we look forward to a valuable session. And in fact, let's get rolling right now, Udo. So welcome, everybody. We're going to share some tales from the front line about everything advisory boards, and we will end up talking about the why of advisory boards, the what is an advisory board, the who are the advisors who are typically involved in advisory boards, how, where, and when can you get started. And we are lucky enough to have Udo with us here today, and I'll introduce him in a moment. Mike Richardson here. I'm in Southern California. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm English originally. Came here when I was running the aerospace division of a British public company, and 23 years ago. And then 20 years ago, I went independent and have been involved with governance boards, advisory boards, and peer advisory boards ever since, amongst many other things. We no doubt have some of our certified chairs here from the Advisory Board Center. I'm a certified chair based here in Southern California. I'll put my LinkedIn in the chat momentarily, and I'll also include Udo's LinkedIn in the chat. But if you're also here as a certified chair with the Advisory Board Center, could you do us a favor and put something into the Q&A with your name, mention you're a certified chair and your location, and stick your LinkedIn link in there as well, if you would. I can see, for instance, that Mohammed is here. I can see that a few other people are coming in. I'll keep my eye on the list. But most of all, we are lucky today to have a special guest, Udo Doring, who is the chair of the Advisory Board Center. He is a globe trotter, let me tell you. He is presently located in London. He's been in the UK a few times in his life and his career. He serves on multiple boards across Australia, Asia, and the UK. He was previously the CEO and president of the Australian Pathway Education Group based in Shanghai, China. He was also the CEO and executive director of the Australian Chamber of Commerce, also in Shanghai. And he's spent time in London previously with the Queensland Government Trade and Investment Office, and not least of all, he did his MBA at the Said Business School at Oxford University. So you are no stranger to the UK, Udo. Welcome today.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm enthralled and encouraged that we didn't see a drop off of attendees after that introduction. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's great to be here. Tell us about the Advisory Board Centre.
Look, I thank you very much for hosting, Mike, and it's always a pleasure to be speaking about advisory boards and the Advisory Board Centre. For those that aren't exposed to the sector or haven't been exposed to the sector or the organisation, the Advisory Board Centre is the global professional body for the advisory board sector. So we're active in 20 markets across the globe. We've got over 500 members in those 20 markets. We're very proud to say that we've helped scope and establish over 1,000 advisory boards across those markets. And the work that we do is really focused on raising the standard of the advisory board sector globally. So we provide research, and we'll be talking about some of that research today as part of our Global Research Council. We provide board level executive education and professional development for those operating in the space. And we also do advocacy work on behalf of the sector as well. So quite a busy organisation.
Yeah, awesome. And today, Udo, if you go to your next slide, we're going to be talking about the State of the Market report. And you do this quite frequently, right? Every couple of years, I believe.
We do. So the Advisory Board Centre has a research arm to the organisation, and it's an organisation or an institution within the Advisory Board Centre called the Global Research Council. The State of the Market report is one of our hero research reports. It's a biannual report, so it's every 2 years that it's released, and it goes into global trends within the sector. So it looks at organisations, looks at advisors, and looks at the interaction between those two. Where is the sector going, and what are the observations that are meaningful for people that are operating in the space? So we'll be diving into a little bit of detail around the state of the market today.
Yeah, great. And then continuing on.
And I guess this is an important slide to frame the conversation with today as well. So the mandate of the Global Research Council is to look at the axes that are on this slide. So if we look at high growth potential and organisations that have high growth potential and good governance, and what the Global Research Council looks at is that white space in between. And I know, Mike, you've got some context that you want to share around perhaps that white space.
Yeah, this is my favorite slide, everybody. You know, because it speaks to the duality of the role of governance boards and the role of advisory boards, and sort of this bright line of fiduciary responsibility in between. And of course, as we'll talk more about, governance boards are subject to increasing regulation and risk and fiduciary responsibility, whereas advisory boards have an increasing focus on the future and future-proofing the business, and have flexibility and independence to really drive the conversation to future-proof the business and realize its full potential. And there was a great article, Udo, that came out from the London Business School only a couple of months ago, where they were talking about reimagining the role of boards in general. And they were talking about the role that boards have to play increasingly going forwards in entrepreneurial leadership, reinterpreting the role of the board of directors. And they talked about the board being in the driving seat of the business, the whole picture here that you're looking at, not just half of it. And they talked about needing to have more meetings. Now, there's an unpopular topic. If ever I heard one, I talk about that a lot in my agility work, more meetings, not less meetings. And they talked about strategy meetings the board needs to have, where they explicitly they're exempted from fiduciary duties. So they intentionally want to cross over that line and operate a lot more like an advisory board, because they realize that they need to have a much more entrepreneurial, flowing, and exploratory conversation about the future and the strategies. And they talk about being in a permanent journey of conversation. And you know how much I like that, Udo, because I talk about C2C, conversation flow to cash flow. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so I think it really does speak to this slide that we've really got to make sure that we're attending to both sides of this equation. And the advisory board side of this equation, Udo, is just becoming more and more and more mission critical. So everybody, you're in the right place today to understand more about that. Back to you, Udo.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I think that is a nod to the agendas are getting bigger when it comes to boards in general, and governance boards in particular. We often hear language from governance board directors talking about wanting to find that safe place to have conversations, and sometimes not necessarily knowing the answers. So I think that's spot on. When we look at the a bit more context building for some of the trends that we'll be looking at today, and some of the stories that we'll be digging in, one of the things that we like to highlight as part of delivering this type of content and presentation or webinar is the report is based in real world input. So anything that we produce in terms of research is directly related to real businesses, real advisors, real advisory boards. And so this gives you a bit of an idea of the input into the report. And as with all great research reports, there are a lot of people that have been involved in building the report and continue to contribute to the report. So this is a slide to say thank you. There's too many names for me to individually name, but we always do like to give credit to the individuals that do continue to contribute to what we think is terrific and really important research.
Yeah, excellent. So this is where we're headed today, everybody. And before we do that, let's just have a quick show of hands here. Just raise your hand with the menu item at the bottom of the page there, if you currently have or serve on an advisory board. Just please raise your hand so that we can see that. So I'm seeing 9 hands raised there, Udo, of people that either have or serve on an advisory board. And if you can lower your hands again, I'm now seeing 10 hands actually. If you can lower your hands again and then raise them again, would you, if you are considering having an advisory board or serving on an advisory board in the future. And so now I'm seeing about again 9 hands raised. So I think we've got a lot of interest here, a lot of experience around the table, Udo. And so I think we've got a nice agenda for you, everybody, to understand the rise of the sector, the market trends, the advisor trends, and the future focus. Back to you, Udo.
So it's a bit of context building for some of the conversation that we'll have today. The advisor engagement model is a model that we use when we're talking about where do advisory boards fit in the provision of advice when it comes to business. And so if we look at the model here, we have a spectrum and informal at the left-hand side of the screen, and then the right-hand side of the screen, we progress to formal advisory structures. So family and friends is the first designation. We've all been at a family event, barbecue, where that conversation has come up, that we're talking about business, and it's an informal interaction around a potential issue, opportunity, problem that someone is having within their organization. The next category is peers in business. And we all know someone that we've worked with in the past that has just a mind for strategy, or a mind for finance, or perhaps you're that person that you find that people come to you to ask your opinion on a particular issue relating to work that they're facing. The next grouping, as we work up the engagement model, is business network groups. And this category, we're looking at chambers of commerce, we're looking at business associations, we're looking at CEO forums or peer groups. So there can be an industry theme to these, there can be a market theme to these, or they can be a sort of a collective of advice provision. Really effective way of being able to engage with businesses, and a very active engagement model. We then move to informal advisory boards. And again, by their very nature, informal, but a grouping of people that gather to deal with particular issues within a particular business. And we see these sometimes from an outward branding face, that they're put together to perhaps promote an organization or give confidence around an organization. So certainly a theme that we see in the market. If we continue to progress up the model, we now reach a cluster of individual advisors. So individual provision of advice. So if we're looking at this, we look at accountants, business mentors, coaches, consultants, and individual expert advisors. So this grouping it's an individual relationship with a business, oftentimes with the CEO, the founder, the business owner, and there is a really strong connection and trust that can be built within this cohort of or grouping of advice provision. Really effective, and especially when it comes to accountants, they live and breathe the cash flow and the journey of clients as well. So they can become very trusted. One of the observations that we do make in this market is that sometimes there can be scope creep. So where there's a trusted relationship and leaning towards more of a friendship with the client, sometimes a business owner won't be able to help themselves. They'll have a problem, they'll ask a question, and it falls outside the remit or expert knowledge or content area of that individual advisor. And they can answer it because they want to help, not because they're well placed to answer the question. So certainly something that we see that creeps into that sector. We then move to formal advisory boards. So this is where a formal advisory board sits. I'll explain the most common structure that we see when it comes to advisory boards. So an independent chair, 2 independent advisors, and 2 internal representatives of an organization. So think CEO and CFO, depending on what the advisory board is looking to cover. So it can be COO, it can be marketing related, but that's traditionally the structure. Well formed, they have a charter. They meet either on a bi-monthly basis or quarterly basis, and there's impact measurement. So they're the consistent elements of what we see in terms of that structure, and they are a problem-solving model. If we move then to governance boards, and this is at the formal end of this spectrum, they are decision-making bodies. So governance boards, the individual directors that sit on those governance boards are responsible and tasked for either creating strategy or endorsing the strategy of the organization. They make decisions on behalf of the organization, and they're individually liable for those decisions. And so when we talk about that burden before that Mike was mentioning, there is a difference between governance boards and advisory boards, and it's an important one to note at this juncture.
A huge difference, isn't it? And when we get to the best practice model later, staying the right side of that fiduciary responsibility bright line is crucial, isn't it, Udo?
Absolutely, and an easy one to potentially flirt with when you're working in this space. So certainly something that as the Advisory Board Centre we talk about a lot in terms of best practice and ethical engagement with advisory board organizations. So it's a good opportunity to move in perhaps to where we see activity, and obviously if we look at the activity represented on this map, nearly 50% of all advisory boards that are publicly registered or available in the public market are in the US or in North America. So a significant proportion of advisory boards in that part of the world. Number 2, in terms of concentration of market, is the UK and continental Europe. So at 15%. So you can see there's certainly a lot of activity in those.
Yeah, and I find this slide really interesting, everybody. As Udo just said, 45% in the USA. Udo, from my experience over 20 years, I find the USA to sort of be paradoxically mature and immature with regard to advisory boards all at the same time. Mature in terms of they're quite common, they're quite prevalent actually. Whether it's a private equity firm that has an advisory board, or a family business that has an advisory board, or a startup and a scale up, that has an advisory board for whatever reasons, and yet can also be somewhat ad hoc, not terribly well structured, friends of friends of friends who populate the board, which later on, everybody, when we talk about the best practice architecture, we will hear something very different to that. And I remember distinctly, Udo, I was on the governance board of a multi-generational family business of automotive dealerships, not my family, another family. I was an external board member, and for 15 years, and we went through so much turbulence over those 15 years. We went through the Great Recession. We went through the whole crisis of Toyota. One of the dealerships was a Toyota, of the runaway, uncommanded acceleration of the Prius and getting dragged in front of Congress, all that kind of stuff. We went through cash for clunkers. We went through the whole digitization of the automotive sales process, the emergence of electronic vehicles and all of that kind of stuff. And what we found increasingly was that the rigor and bureaucracy of the board process just couldn't keep up with everything that we had to talk about on that side. So what we ended up doing often was spinning out sort of parallel, conversation flows, parallel committees, parallel sort of almost project advisory boards to deal with those individual things, because we just were choking. There was too much to talk about, and we were choking on it, in the formal board process. So I think there's lots of opportunity in the USA to bring more best practice architecture and structure to the advisory board track of a business or a corporation.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, it is an astute observation. We certainly are seeing a sophistication and a want for sophistication and evolution in the way that businesses are engaging with advisory boards. If we look back even 3 years ago, one of the first questions that we would hear from organisations would be, who do I get to sit on my advisory? They go straight to the who. And we're certainly seeing a change or a shift in the market where more often now you're hearing organizations ask the question, we need to do this, or we want to do this. How do we do it well? And that is it's a promising sign for everyone involved.
Yeah. And by the way, everybody, if you're keeping your eye on the Q&A, you'll see that I've been answering the chats that the certified advisory board chairs have been putting in. And I believe in answering the way I have done. They're shared in public now in the answered Q&A menu item, if you go look there. And as you can see, we've got certified chairs all over the place, here in the USA, in the UK, all over the world. So it's part of that data set that you were just looking at on that previous slide. Back to you, Udo.
We're going to move into some market trends to give people some context around some of the observations that we see in a few different markets or segments of the advisory board market, and perhaps this gives a bit of context around what we see in emerging in the business sector, corporatized, and then project advisory boards as well. And so we'll take a journey through those different groupings. The emerging business is a business that we categorize at the Advisory Board Centre as pre-revenue through to $1.5 million turnover. Now, I have to make an announcement in terms of currency. So we've worked on quite a bit of research and data matching in terms of what those currencies look like, even before the recent turbulence with pound. It's safe to say pre-revenue to $1.5 million US in the US, and same in pounds. And then for anyone that's in continental Europe, same in euro. So they tend to be within a margin of error that they track accurately. Now, there's 4 key barriers to scale that we see in this sector that advisory boards are dealing with, and or that businesses struggle with in this sector of the market. Delegation is number 1. So how do I build a business beyond myself as the founder? How do I grow up and multiply beyond myself? The next is network access, and it's a similar point, but it is, how do I interact with people beyond my social circle and or commercial circle? So we're doing business in this particular area or this particular periphery, and I'm selling to my services or product to this piece. How do I go beyond the people that I already know? It's number two. Number three is execution. You'll find businesses in this sector or segment high on strategy and can struggle with execution. So they've got business plans, they've got ideas, they've got models. The doing can be a challenge when looking at actually applying some of that thinking. And then finally, and very interestingly, business investment literacy. And what we mean by this is not financial literacy, it's investment literacy as it relates to their own business. There is a want and intent to invest in their own business, but there is a knowledge gap when it comes to concepts like return on investment, return on equity. So they're sort of the language cues, some of the language cues that you'll hear in that particular segment of the market. 29% of all advisory board engagements happen in this segment of the market. Some people will naturally think that this is an unsophisticated sector of the market, but we do see incredibly well-funded organizations that sit within this realm. So I think well-funded technology businesses, medical technology, food technology, energy businesses. So there's some really quite sophisticated businesses that are proving out a particular technology. So there's certainly some interesting work in this space when it comes to advisory boards. There is a volatility rate here that is worth noting. So you do tend to see a flurry of activity relating to particular events within these businesses. And so there'll be a flurry of activity, and then we'll get back to work, and then a flurry of activity, and then we'll get back to normal. And so it is an observation that we make. The other observation that we do make in state of the market is that advisor panels are well-trodden path for this segment of the market. So think accelerators and incubators. They do engage with panels, advisor panels.
Yeah, awesome.
If we then transition to the next segment, and we're looking at trends in the business sector now. So again, think currencies in home markets for anyone that is in those particular markets. 1.5 million to $100 million turnover. That's the sort of categorization of the business sector. The most common structure for an advisory board that we see in the sector: an independent chair, 2 independent advisors, and 2 internal representatives from the organization. And in the business sector, more often than not, and I would suggest upwards of 90%, the founder, the business owner, the CEO. So the principal is in that room. Most common starting point for an advisory board in the business sector is $1.5 million turnover. So that's where we see the most activity in terms of the starting point. The average size within the business sector sits at about $18 million turnover. Now, it's a range, and so we're talking averages and we're talking activity, but it gives you a bit of an idea or a flavour of what we see in the market.
Yeah, and it's kind of where you really start to run into complexity. You especially as you get into the $5 million, $10 million, $15 million range. It can get overwhelming real fast if you're unprepared and not anticipating what's coming next. So having some experience around the table really makes a difference.
Absolutely, and that is something common that we do hear from businesses that are engaging with advisory boards in this sector, that they're looking to make confident decisions. Over 70% of businesses that are looking to establish an advisory board in the business sector, the trigger is growth, or the want is growth. So that's the reason. And the subtext of that conversation is that they want to feel more confident about the decisions that they're undertaking and the strategy that they're deploying. So as the stakes get higher, the confidence needs to grow with that as well. The final thing that I would say around this slide is that on average, the investment that we see in the business sector from businesses is $40,000 to $70,000 in the first year to establish an advisory board. So that's the investment that on average they're making. What we also know is that in the second year that increases. So we see that number increase in year 2 when organizations continue advisory boards.
And of course, everybody, it is an investment. That in some respects, that sounds like a significant amount of money. But of course, what you've just heard Udo talk about is it's all about confidence and decision making. Imagine the stakes of some of those decisions. Imagine the costs if you get them wrong and the rewards if you get them right. So in the scheme of all of that, it can be a great return on investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things to note is that is across a 12-month period. So for anyone that is involved with businesses in that sector, the very nature of an advisory board is that it's a longer term engagement, and because of that, it's sort of a manageable investment as well. So the next set of trends that we do see in the business sector, Mike, and I am conscious we're covering a lot of ground, so I'm trying to make sure that
that's all good.
The most prevalent sector when it comes to advisory boards in this big business segment is professional services. Yeah. They engage with advisory boards at a higher rate than any other sector that we see. Within that, the highest subsector is technology at 14%. So a lot of interest in technology and a lot of adoption in technology businesses right across the spectrum. The right-hand side of this slide is advisory board engagement, and it's mapped to business growth cycles. So this is a model that we use to engage with businesses and to identify in which cycle they're operating in. You'll see probably the most notable thing is that there's not many advisory board engagements when it comes to exiting businesses, and the reason is they are exiting, so they don't stay in that stage for very long. But across the other cycles, again, the number one trigger in this sector is growth. So whatever cycle they find themselves in, over 70% of businesses that are engaging with advisory boards are doing so because they're hunting growth. They're wanting to grow the organization. Corporatized advisory boards. So taking a slight shift in terms of the size and scale of advisory boards that we're talking about. This slide gives you a bit of an idea of the types of brands that are engaging with advisory boards within a corporate setting. I will define corporatized advisory boards because I think it is important to give a bit of an explanation of how they fit. So as Mike was telling the story about the governance board that he has experienced over that 15-year period and the establishment of committees that sat within that governance structure, but separate to the governance structure, corporatized advisory boards fit into that governance ecosystem in a similar way. So a corporatized advisory board is where there is a governance board that's established and an established governance framework within a larger organization. And an advisory board is set up within that ecosystem to deal with a challenge, an opportunity, a particular issue, a particular strategy. So, and we're seeing an increasing adoption of corporatized advisory boards across every sector and across every market. So it certainly is a trend that is increasing at the moment. One of the theories that we have, or the observations that we would make around why this is happening, does relate to the conversation that Mike was sharing, or the experience that Mike was sharing earlier. As a trend globally, governance boards are shrinking, and it was recently identified as one of the top 5 governance trends by the FT, the Financial Times newspaper, and the reasons behind that are wide and varied. One of the reasons that we believe governance boards are shrinking is the agendas are increasing and the cost is increasing as well. So the impost of businesses is increasing. And to demonstrate that as one example, directors and officers insurance increased by 229%. The premiums in 2021, according to Marsh's Global Insurance Report. Now, that was 2021. the 2022 numbers haven't been released yet, but we believe that they're going to be relatively similar or aligned to these numbers. So you can imagine that as a demonstration of increase in costs and a representation of risk, it certainly is becoming more expensive to those boards.
Yeah, and so we're sort of back to where we started, aren't we, Udo? We're back to this graph, which really becomes the backdrop, everybody, to the narrative and dialogue that we're having, where you've got these two sides of the equation. And as Udo just said, the governance board side of this picture is under pressure. As you just heard, there are trends that governance boards are shrinking. Now, we also know in parallel they're diversifying qualitatively, as it were, but quantitatively, there are some trends that say that they are shrinking. And as you just heard, the insurance premiums are going up. And that is why there is this rising tide of interest now on the advisory board side. On the other side of that bright line of fiduciary responsibility, how do we have a more flexible, more independent, more future-proofing conversation flow going on over there, as long as it is well-structured, well-architected, with best practices and a degree of independence. And, you know, Udo, I worked with a technology company for 3 years on the governance side of their equation. I wasn't on their governance board, but I was facilitating their executive team, their CEO, doing their annual and their quarterly strategic process for 3 years all over the world. They were a global company, and we would rendezvous every quarter for 3 days all over the world. And I did that with them for 3 years. And it was all around, you know, agility and future-proofing themselves and dealing with the turbulence that was in their future. And it was all going very, very well. So much so that their sort of trailing average graphs were all trending in the right direction and really sort of breaking through to a next level. And unfortunately, behind the scenes that I wasn't involved with, they had an advisory board. And unfortunately, it wasn't as well architected and structured as it should have been. It didn't have the independence it should have had. And lo and behold, unbeknownst to me, 2 members of the advisory board started lobbying the entrepreneur owner that one of them should become the new CEO and the other should become the new COO. And lo and behold, they fired the incumbent CEO and installed one advisory board member to replace him and the other as the COO, and terminated my services simultaneously, of course. And of course, I never ever saw the graphs ever again, but I did hear on the grapevine that the graphs, you know, started reversing and started taking a nosedive. And so you have to be very careful, everybody, that, you know, on the other side of the line, if you have an advisory board process, it needs to be well architected, well structured, with specialists and experts on that advisory board that have a degree of independence, and stay in a balanced process. And that's one of the reasons, Udo, why I'm so keen on this graph, because there are so many stories that sit right behind it.
No, absolutely, and I think that's spot on, Mike. I think the one of the observations that we make when we talk about best practice is independence is a really important piece. Now, independence is relative. There's alignment, but you can see, you know, I think it's relatively obvious in that case that there was perhaps a conflict of interest in the way that progressed. And you know, even
exactly.
Looking at that obligation around governance boards as well, you know, one of the things that we certainly are seeing as a trend, and it does relate to what you were talking about earlier as well, is the agenda is getting bigger, and so when we're looking at that governance board and the corporate setting, there's more and more being added to the agenda, and there's less people, so governance boards are shrinking, and so there's less time and there's less headspace to be able to deal with them, and so. You know, we've got a really well-formed case study of a company that had employed a cybersecurity expert who was a governance board director, and they were dealing with a new cybersecurity strategy for the organization, and all of the directors essentially looked at this cybersecurity director and said, "What do you think about the proposal?" And it was at that point that they didn't find resolution in the meeting, but as a result of that conversation, that particular director insisted that there be an advisory board created, because he was confident in his ability, but he didn't want to be the person that everyone that deferred the cybersecurity decisions to or deliberations to. And his reasoning was, I may miss something, or there's something new that comes up all the time, and I want to make sure that we're working through good process to be able to land on a good result. So it was individual exposure, but also a nod to how do we get a better result for the organisation, and the flow on was an advisory board. So we are seeing that application or that symbiotic relationship as well develop as a result of that growing agenda.
Yeah.
Project advisory boards, Mike. We're moving on. Now, this is a really interesting trend that we are seeing, and if we were asked to pull out our crystal ball, our view is that project advisory boards may, at some point soon, overtake all the business advisory boards as a representative of the advisory board sector. And the reason is they are really effective bodies to be able to deal with particular issues. And so where we talk about an all of business advisory board, we talk about the advisory board dealing with the strategy of the organization. Where we talk about a project advisory board, we talk about the project advisory board dealing with a strategy. So it's road testing a particular strategy, and we've seen the adoption of project advisory boards increase in a really significant way, and it's a trend that shouldn't be ignored. So when we're looking at the triggers of where we see project advisory boards, the first is new business models. So this is applicable, and we've seen them be used in large organizations, so in corporates, looking to test a new business model, as well as small organizations. And think about COVID, and think about what that did to a lot of businesses in terms of digital strategy, and think about where they are now in a sort of post-COVID world, and what's actually, where do we land when it comes to some of those business models? Do we revert to pre-COVID operations? Do we stay at absolute digital, or is there a hybrid integration of some of those business models? So certainly an interesting trigger for advisory boards, and some interesting conversations happening at that level. Market testing is the next. So testing new markets and or testing new products. And we see this again, large organizations, but also small organizations, and oftentimes can be related to technology as well. The next is crisis, and you'll see that it's not a huge representative size, but certainly some interesting examples of project advisory boards, and we actually anecdotally were made aware of a large technology business based in the US that has established a crisis advisory board, project advisory board, to deal with an unsolicited offer that was made, that was then rescinded, that now may be on again. So I'll leave you to read into the
and you'll let us guess who that might have been.
Perhaps you'll land on that example, but you can imagine that the stakeholders that are involved dealing with that issue and challenge for the organization. And so a project advisory board has been adopted. So, international markets. This is a really interesting one. I think the genesis or the start of this trend was really based around closed borders. So we started seeing an increase in advisory boards, international market advisory boards, where it came to closed borders and travel restrictions. What we're seeing now is a bit of an evolution of the way that people are talking about those, and businesses are looking at geopolitical risk in a different way, and saying, if certain parts of the world, if certain things happen and we have $100 million, $10 million, $1 billion that comes from a particular market. What do we do? How do we deal with that? And so again, a bit of an evolution of the way that that's working. And finally, investment ready. So liquidity events, either pre-liquidity events or post, and the integration. So some really interesting examples of project advisory boards.
Yeah, and I was on the board of a not-for-profit in San Diego, Junior Achievement San Diego, for I think probably 10 years. And right at the start of that process, we were doing their strategy process that I was facilitating, and they had the inkling of an idea that we included in the strategy document to build a massive mini city, fully computerized, that kids come into and run for the day, and they see it at the end of the day, whether they made money or not. And then we did another thing on the end of the building for older kids called Finance Park, which they come in and operate for the day. And of course, we spun off, some advisory boards for those specific projects, because relative to the size of the not-for-profit, they were substantial, high risk and high reward investments. And so we ran with probably an advisory board for probably 2 years, for the duration of those specific projects, and it worked incredibly well.
No, a really, really interesting manifestation of advisory boards and a focus of advisory boards. So we've seen them be 3-month engagements. We've seen them be 24-month engagements. They're so agile and fit for purpose. So really, really good way of being.
So how is all of this helping to move the needle, Udo? How's it helping have an impact on business?
Thanks, Mike. I never thought you'd ask. So this is a really important part of the research as well that we see. And again, these are business inputs that come from real businesses, real advisory boards, and real advisors. And so the so what is the question. Where advisory boards are implemented with organizations, what do they actually mean? Do they have an impact on the organization? 90% of organizations that implement advisory boards document a positive impact on their organization, on their business. And if we go a little bit further, they see on average a 15% increase in financial results, a positive impact. And probably most importantly to us is a 30% increase on average in business confidence. And so when we look at this, and especially when we look at it from the business sector point of view, we equate 30% increase in business confidence to 30% more sleep for business owners.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Especially if it's a privately held company, a family business, to be able to sleep a little easier, that we're a little bit more future-proof than we used to be. That is huge.
And it's really rewarding, and I think an important metric to keep in mind when you're dealing with advisory boards and structures like these, because not everything boils down to the black and white P&L. There are other considerations, especially to your point, when it's a family business, when it's a privately held business, there can be more at play than just how's that graph tracking. So that's a really interesting and a really promising result. We do obviously have the counter side, and it's important to note that advisory boards don't fit every business and they don't fit every situation. So you'll see here of the other 10%, they noted a negative impact overall on their business. So on average, they saw a 6% drop in financial results and a 3% drop when it comes to business confidence. So again,
yeah, and to some degree, that story I was telling earlier, they were on the prior page for a while, and then they got onto this page thereafter. What a shame that was.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we do note here when we talk about this, one of the common threads that we see in the negative impact segment of the sample is the number one issue for these organizations was cash flow. And advisory boards are longer term engagements. And so what's important to note here is where the number one issue for an organization or a business's cash flow, advisory boards perhaps aren't the best intervention or mechanism to be able to address that. And it's important that everyone that's involved understands that. It's not an easy conversation to have, but where you're engaging in the longer term, if the cash flow is urgent and imminent, there's a gap there that the advisory board probably won't address in the short term. So it's an important note to make as well.
Great. So you've told us about companies. Now tell us about the kinds of people that are sat around the table as advisors.
So again, I turn to this slide, and one of the statistics that I think is an important one to note here, Mike, is we've seen a 52% increase in advisory boards since 2019. Yeah. And what that means to us as a professional body that is taking care of the sector, it's a wonderful development in terms of the market, because what it represents to us is as business is becoming more complex and the challenges are growing, there is an increase in the demand for advice and the democratization of that advice. So perhaps organizations that weren't getting access to the way that some of these people can think and come at problems is now available to them. So it's a really positive sign, we think, for the sector.
Yeah, that is a huge number, everybody, in just a couple of years there.
Yeah, and
massive trend.
And what we think we'll see when it comes time to look at the next stage of that data, we think that the growth will be at a similar pace, if not compounding. So it's a terrific statistic. One of the things that it does mean to us is that we know that people that are stepping into this market for the first time are perhaps stepping into providing advice for the first time as well. And so there's an increased responsibility for people that are stepping into the space to make sure that they're engaging ethically in providing advice, and that they're thinking about making sure that they make a positive impact in the organizations that they're dealing with as well. So it's important that we named that as well. It's an important part of the engagement that we see across the sector. As for the type of people that we see engaging in the sector, this is a data that is directly related to our community and our membership at the Advisory Board Centre. And so 60%, so if we look at what's happening in the market, we see about 50% of our current members have governance board roles as well as advisory board roles. So there's a balance. What we're seeing in terms of future intent is there seems to be a rebalancing happening and perhaps a de-risking happening. So their future want or intent is to increase advisory board engagements more than they are looking for governance board engagement. So that's an observation that we see. And that's consistent across those that are C-suite executives, that are governance and advisory board directors, advisors, and entrepreneurs and investors. So it's a universal observation. The other thing that we note is, on average, those that are engaging in the sector have, on average, about 5 engagements when it comes to advisory boards. So that's the average makeup of the portfolio of advisory.
Yeah, so these are like many of the people on the call here, and like you and I, these are true sort of portfolio professionals, right? They had a corporate career, no doubt, at some point, and then they went to a portfolio career, and they have a mixed bag portfolio of these kinds of engagements, and no doubt others. And just speaking for myself, what I love about that is the diversity of it, and I get to be in industries and businesses that perhaps I haven't worked with before, and bring a fresh set of eyes and a fresh set of ears around the table.
Absolutely, and that's consistent. I think there's what we see in terms of the characteristics is that people have a professional body of work and expertise to be able to lean on, and the shift then into the portfolio space is how do I apply that knowledge, that expertise? How do I contribute in a different way and in different settings? So that certainly is a consistent trait of people that we see active in the advisory board sector.
Okay, and so where do we begin to go from here, Udo?
Well, so one of the important pieces that we do make sure that we talk to when we are talking about the advisory board sector is the concept of best practice and ethical engagement. And you would have heard that laced in the conversation today, but it's important for a market that, broadly speaking, across the majority of jurisdictions in the world is unregulated and unlegislated. In 2020, we released the first principle-based framework, ABF 101, and it's a best practice framework around the ethical engagement in the advisory board sector. So if someone's looking to engage, whether it's an organization or it's an individual, how do you do this well? What does best practice look like in advisory boards? And you'll see here listed on the slide that it talks about things like independence. So the importance of independence when looking at advisory board structures. It talks to being fit for purpose, or advisory boards being fit for purpose for what they're looking to address within an organization. So whether that's an all of a business advisory board or whether that's a project advisory board. It looks at impact measurement. So how do you know where you're starting from and what the priorities are? And then where do you measure to see what the impact of an advisory board has been? And
and this was a huge, when I was looking for, who is it that's on the leading edge of bringing structure and best practice and research-based frameworks to advisory boards, quickly ran into the advisory board center. And so this was a major part of what really attracted me to get involved.
And I think, Mike, it's a really important one, because the impact measurement denotes not just where's an organization at, but also how does an individual business owner or founder feel about their business as well. So the ability to be able to get into a little bit of that sort of out of numbers qualitative information and priorities are a really important context builder for advisory boards. And then that obviously does lead into structure and discipline. So making sure that it's not an informal engagement where it's everyone just talks and nothing happens, but what do we actually do? And then clarity of scope. So really everyone knowing exactly where we're heading. So the ABF 101 is a resource that we have available on the website. We encourage everyone and anyone that is interested in this sector to engage with it. It's complementary. It's something that we really want to make sure is pervasive for anyone that's dealing in the space, because if nothing else, it's a terrific thought exercise to challenge your thinking around how do we do if we're going to embark on this.
Brilliant. Yeah, really cool. It's one of my most crucial aspects of being a certified chair with the advisory board center is to have that rigor of a best practice platform to lean on.
Yeah, and the final piece that I would say about this is it's a framework that we have a related best practice and ethics advisory board that continues to validate and update what best practice is and what it looks like. So we've got representation from Mexico, from Singapore, from Europe, from Australia, from corporate, from government, from the scale-up, startup. So it's a really important part of what we do, that we're always looking to make sure that we stay abreast of what's happening in the market and try and stay ahead of it, so that we're able to give that sort of a structure and framework to people that are operating in the space.
Cool. And that brings us full circle. Here we are again at this sort of backdrop slide, and as the title says, there is this increasing tension between the two sides of this puzzle here. And increasingly, the advisory board side is a rising trend, as you've heard. And actually, I have a client right now that is a global fast growth technology company that is looking ahead, a year or two or three, considering potential of going public with an IPO here in the USA. And of course, that would mean, going IPO is one thing, being IPO is a whole nother thing, for which they would have to have a very rigorous governance board process. And what I'm in the beginnings of a conversation with them right now is, well, no better way to put on your sort of training wheels and get limbered up for that than to start an advisory board process sooner, to help you go on that project transition as well. So that's what they're now considering doing as a precursor to the government's board that they will ultimately need to have. You've given us a great speed tour here, Udo. Of course, you can't do justice to this topic in just the space of an hour. So we've got some follow-up links for everybody on the next slide. We'll also this slide. Sorry about that. And we'll also put these in the show notes afterwards. But just go back on your way there. Do go back to the prior slide and just give us a little overview, and then we'll bring us home.
Yeah, look, and I think, thank you, Mike. It is, we've condensed quite a bit into an hour, and we're really conscious of that. So this is an area and content area that I think both Mike and I could talk for hours and hours about. One of the things that I think is important to talk to is, for anyone that's interested in engaging with the advisory board sector, whether that's an organization that's looking to establish an advisory board, or an individual that's looking to engage as an advisor or chair, so looking to establish and work on advisory boards. The Advisory Board Centre is really, really happy to have conversations on both of those sides. And so this gives you a bit of an idea, this slide gives you a bit of an idea of the work that we do around best practice education and certification. So for those that are looking for a frame of reference to be able to engage with, a community of people that are really deeply skilled and engaged, that are able to offer advice, and not just to businesses but to each other as well. It's rich content, but it's always changing. So that's a really rewarding piece. We're committed to research as well, and we continue to do that, and professional development along the way as well. So if anyone does want to reach out and have a conversation around any of that, please feel free to.
Yeah, and so we've got some links here for you, everybody, on this next page, and easy to use QR codes. We'll also post these links in the show notes afterwards. So just tell us about these three different pathways that people could go down here, Udo.
So the ABF 101 is for anyone that's looking to engage with advisory boards, full stop. So what does best practice look like in the advisory board sector? And how do you come at best practice? So it's free to download. It's a terrific thought exercise, and it's a good starting point for either organizations or for individuals. The Advisor Concierge is a service that the Advisory Board Centre offers at no cost to any organization anywhere in the world. So if you're looking to establish an advisory board as an organization or a business, reach out, and we're really happy to have a conversation to work through what those priorities potentially look like, what the structure potentially could look like, what the advisor matrix could look like. And off the back of that, we're really happy to broadcast those particular advisor profiles to our broader community. And so it gives you a confidence that you're dealing with people that have engaged with best practice and understand how to take you on that journey. So a really interesting process to go through for anyone that's looking to consider establishing an advisory board. And the final QR code is if any of you are interested in having a conversation with either of us. So with myself and or with Mike around anything that we've talked about today, please scan the code. We're really happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, beautiful. So there you have it, everybody. Just in a minute or two that we've got left here, if you have any big burning questions, please type them into the Q&A. And perhaps while we're keeping our eye on that, Udo, just give us another little minute or so on the concierge service little bit more on what that is and how it works and how valuable it is. It's one of the most beautiful aspects I find of the whole advisory board center proposition.
Look, Mike, it is a wonderful service, and I guess I'm biased, so of course I'm going to say that. But it is, when an organization looks to establish an advisory board, sometimes they're not ready yet to identify who they want. They want to work through, what does this actually look like? How could this come together? What are the types of priorities? What are the types of structures? Perhaps, questioning around what does the remuneration traditionally look like? And so the concierge service is a guided process that it just helps prepare organizations to be able to work towards finding some of those answers before they engage with an individual. And so that can be an individual chair or an individual advisor, and they may already have a view to who they are, but it's more around that structure piece. And so our commitment to the market is that we want to make sure that the advisory board sector continues to professionalize and continues in the direction of best practice. And so this is our commitment to the market, that we will have conversations with anyone, anywhere that's looking to establish an advisory board and try and help set them on the right course.
And what I love about the concierge service, everybody, is ultimately it gives you access to the 500, 600 certified chairs all over the world with a degree of independence for you to get a concierge service, to find the kind of profile of people that you're looking for, with the independence that you need to have a best practice architecture of an advisory board. Udo, this has been phenomenal today. Thank you so much for being with us, number one, out of London. Thanks for all the work that you do globally with the Advisory Board Center. Thanks for the support that you're giving us here in the USA to help build out the footprint, because the time is now, everybody. The time is right. Whether you are a company considering forming an advisory board, or you're a professional considering becoming an advisor, click on one of these links here, go to one of these QR codes. We would love to chat with you. And thanks again, Udo, and we'll see you next time, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, everyone.